All right, let's talk about one of my favorite topics, American college sports. This is, of course, the industry that I used to work in before I went the professorial route, the academic route. And so I have quite a bit of work history background and still have contacts in college sports and still enjoy quite a few games as a fan, both in person and on TV. So let's talk about why we have college sports. The authors of the Gaming the World book they asked this question. I've sort of given away the answer in my introduction, but what do they see as the most unique aspect of American sports and culture? Sure enough, it is our college sports system. There's just nothing like it in the rest of the world. What is it that distinguishes our U.S. college sports? Why do we say that there's nothing else like it in the rest of the world? Well, the rest of the world does not couple higher education and elite athletics the way that we do. Instead, in the rest of the world, you have these athletic clubs that have academy systems where athletes will move up through the academy as they get better and better and eventually get to the elite level if they're good enough. But it's not attached to higher education, right? Some of the larger academies may have schools attached to them, but they're not universities, the way that we have here in the U.S. And we'll talk about why we have the system that we have historically in just a few minutes. So, something that we don't want to let slip by, and the authors do well to point out, is the relationship between our college sports system and the fact that we have had much more Olympic success than any other country. Actually, in the 110 years of the modern Olympics, the U.S. has 2,514 medals at the time of this recording, and the next closest country is Russia or the Soviet Union. Of course, the Soviet Union, but now is just Russia. Even if you combine their medal count, you get 1,000 less than the amount of medals that the U.S. has won in Winter and Summer Olympics over the last 100 plus years. Why are we so dominant in the Olympics? Well, it's because of this college sports system. Think about the system of college sports and how, in order to be a Division I institution, right, the highest level, you have to sponsor a minimum of 13 sports, which means most programs have field hockey teams, cross-country teams, basketball teams, volleyball teams, swimming teams. You've got all of these teams with well-regarded coaches that's what they do full-time, right? At all of these universities, I think there's about 280 Division I universities, something like that. And each of those are sponsoring 13 varsity sports, right? So you've got this huge training system happening, right? And all of these athletes that are getting this elite training and facilities, and then from those we can pick the very best to be our Olympic athletes. So that system is much more widespread in terms of just the sheer numbers that we have associated with it, and the number of sports, not just the number of athletes, but the number of sports that we have very elite level training and coaching for. Elsewhere, as I mentioned, there's a sports club network, or you have what's called state-run sports ministries, where essentially they are trying to generate or create Olympic athletes in certain sports. But typically, and those are state-run, so sponsored by taxpayers. And that's in contrast to our system, where yes, we have USA Boxing and USA Swimming and USA Basketball, but the bulk of that funding comes from corporate sponsors of the United States Olympic Committee, or sponsors of USA Boxing directly, let's say, for example. And so that's very different than the system that the rest of the world uses. And we see globalization within this system that we have developed. And by that I mean, you've probably watched the Olympics before and say like the 400-meter finals, and they go down through the lanes as they're introducing the different athletes. And there might be 1 or 2 Americans in the final heat, let's say, or the final race, I should say. But yet, you typically, when the announcer's introducing them, you hear them say, even for the other competitors, that so-and-so is swimming or running for Ireland, and they competed for LSU in the SEC championship and won, this race at the SEC championship, right? So you get this immigration of high-level athletes to the U.S. because they want to be part of our collegiate training system, and they also want to get a degree from our universities. We're widely seen around the world as having the most number and elite level of higher education. That's not to say that there aren't good universities outside the U.S. There certainly are, but we are known for sort of the birthplace of broad higher education for everybody, right? Instead of only for the elite class. And as a result, we have many more universities per capita than any other country. So that's part of the globalization, is that system draws people in, draws elite athletes from all over the world in to train and compete here, and many of those eventually become U.S. citizens. However, within college athletics, it's not all rosy. You really have these two different worlds of college athletics. You have football and men's basketball, and then you have every other sport, right? And by that, I mean, and the authors, as they describe in the chapter, we're talking about from a revenue perspective. Like a huge bulk of the revenue, 90+% for most of these college sports institutions, come from football and men's basketball. So what kind of revenue sources are we talking about? Well, wait, before we talk about that, one quick caveat. There are, of course, exceptions to this rule, such as at UConn or Tennessee, where their women's basketball program brings in a large amount of money, a huge amount of money. Notre Dame, Stanford, Baylor have pretty prominent women's basketball programs. As you go through the Southeast, especially, you get some baseball programs that are pretty decent revenue-producing programs. At one of the institutions I worked at, Miami University, our hockey program produced a respectable amount of revenue for our athletic department. So as you get up into the north, northeast, and north Midwest, you get some pretty good hockey programs that will produce some revenue. But by and large, considering that 13 sports sponsored is the minimum for Division I, and a lot of schools will sponsor 20. When I was at Ohio State, we sponsored 34 varsity sports, believe it or not. We won the national championship in rifle while I was there, and I did not even realize we had a rifle team. Don't tell anybody. But we got the email in the athletic department, and me and the other GA that I worked with looked at each other, and we were like, we have rifle? Like, we got to go and see one of these. Well, maybe we don't want to be a spectator at a rifle meet. Well, they're the national championship. They're the national champions, so they're probably pretty accurate with their shooting. So you've got these two different worlds, right, from a revenue perspective. So what are the revenue sources? Here's your list. You probably could have come up with this if I would have given you enough time. Merchandise or royalties off of merchandise typically are about anywhere from 6 to 9% of the purchase price of, say, a hat that you buy or a sweatshirt, shirt, goes back to the institution that owns the logos. Broadcasting, corporate sponsors, and then private donors is a pretty significant revenue source in college athletics that you don't really have in professional sports, right? But you have these private donors. And that is linked into ticket sales as well, because to get the best seats at these big institutions at their sporting events, you have to be a donor at a certain level and then also buy the ticket, right? Ticket sales being another major revenue source around football and basketball. Let's talk about spectators. And this is something that, again, differentiates the U.S. hugely from the rest of the world. I mean, the rest of the world does have some collegiate teams or some athletic teams affiliated with their universities. The difference is they're not that popular from a spectator standpoint. They're almost more like intramural, or what we would think of as club competitions, right? Not our varsity competitions that attract stadiums like Neyland Stadium that you see on the slide there with over 100,000 people. Only the Super Bowl draws better TV ratings than some of the major college football games each year. Of the world's 20 top stadiums, so we're talking about top in terms of capacity, the 20 largest capacity stadiums in the entire world, not just the U.S., the entire world, 10 of them are U.S. college football stadiums. Just in the Big Ten, you have Penn State, Ohio State, and Michigan with stadiums that seat over 100,000 people. And all three of those fall in the world's top 20 stadiums for size. So, how did this fascination with football in particular here in the U.S. happen? Well, there's a story behind it, and the chapter tells the story pretty well. If you haven't yet read it, you should definitely read it. It's something that you should take away from this class and remember as a good story to tell. Bloody Monday. So, at Harvard and Yale and several other elite East Coast institutions, they had this tradition called Bloody Monday, where basically the sophomores would beat up on the freshmen in a game of what they called football, right? Now, this football was more dribbling than handling in code at the time, and by that I mean more dribbling, more like soccer than, say, rugby at the time. But it's basically just gives upperclassmen a reason to beat up on the freshmen. Kind of a hazing ritual, if you will, the first Monday of each term. Well, Harvard bans it, right? Some individuals get hurt really bad in addition to Bloody Monday, and Harvard bans the practice. Meanwhile, at Yale, Princeton, and Rutgers, they're drawing up some rules. They're codifying the rules between them, and they're hoping to form a league. This is in late 1800s. 1873 is the year quoted in your book. But Harvard eschews, meaning they say, no, we're not going to be in your association football league. Remember, we're talking more about the dribbling code of the sport than handling at the time. So they decide they're not going to be a part of it, even after the ban gets lifted at Harvard. Because what happens is, up at McGill, a very prestigious private, or a very prestigious university in Montreal, which is not that far from Massachusetts, obviously up north across the border in Canada. McGill hears about this, that Harvard's Bloody Monday, their association football essentially is banned, and they decide that they're going to challenge Harvard to a game of football, but more in the handling code, which was not banned. And McGill played a certain style of rugby that was a little bit different than what they were playing at Harvard at the time, and so they agree to play each other in essentially a doubleheader. Harvard likes McGill's rugby style, and even though they had never played by that particular style of rugby, they hold McGill scoreless. Neither team scores in the instance, so it ends up being a tie. And Harvard likes this idea of sort of emulating the Oxford of North America, which they think of as McGill, and they're into this new sport of rugby. And they're less into Yale. They sort of see Yale as, yeah, they're a rival, but they're not as prestigious at the time as McGill or certainly Oxford over in England. But Yale, they miss their rival. They're like, their response is, hey, we miss you. We can't formulate this league without our biggest rival, right? And And there's probably a little bit of asymmetry to the rival in terms of, I said Harvard thought of themselves as being a little bit better than Yale. Yale's like, no, we got to play against you in sports so we can prove that we're better. So Yale's response is to come to Harvard, or to go to Harvard and say, okay, well, we'll compromise with you, right? Like, we don't have to play association football in our league. Why don't we compromise, and we'll come up with some sort of standardization of the rules that is somewhat in between sort of the rugby style that Harvard's playing and yet in our style of association football. And what do they come up with? That's right, the origins of American football. So from that you can take the origins of American football actually come from the desire to maintain the Harvard-Yale rivalry in sports. That's where it comes from. Sweet. But what about collegiate sports in general, or intercollegiate sports, I should say? What's the first intercollegiate sport? Guesses? It's not football. It's not rugby. It's not association football. It's crew, and it starts in England. Actually, it's cricket. Excuse me. It's cricket. It starts in England. England starts with Oxford versus Cambridge, and then soon after that they row against each other as well. You can see a picture of it there, rowing along the Thames River in London. Excuse me. In the U.S., our first intercollegiate sport is crew as well. Harvard and Yale row against each other in 1852. And in that first match, you might, if you remember from the chapter, Yale protests and says Harvard uses an illegal participant. So the first intercollegiate match has a protest associated with it over an ineligible rower, coxswain. Not sure what you call what the correct word of a rower is. I think coxswains, who calls out the calls or something like that. Anyway, Harvard also goes across the pond and challenges Oxford to a crew race, and the media really loves this over there, and they pick it up and they talk about it as being emblematic of more than just a race between two crew teams, but as a competition between the educational systems in each country. You have the best coming from America and Harvard, the best in Oxford and England, and they race each other. This is a narrative that comes up again and again, right? Using sports as being symbolic of something even bigger than what it is. Also, this idea of Americans wanting to challenge their English kind of predecessors as a way to sort of establish their dominance over England, despite the fact that England was previously dominated or colonized major parts of the U.S., right? This is our way to sort of continually break away and say, we are no longer under your rule. We saw that with the Davis Cup, for example, and we saw that with the Ashes, although that was Australia, not us, the U.S., challenging England. So this match between Harvard and Oxford draws over 250,000 spectators along the river, and it is that familiar media narrative. However, something very significant happens in our intercollegiate sports here in the U.S. In 1871. Harvard is going to race against Yale in their traditional regatta, and Yale shows up with this boat that has movable seats, and Harvard says, nope, you can't race us in that boat, it's illegal. Yale says it is not illegal. Yale refuses to use another boat because they claim their boat is perfectly legal. Harvard refuses to race them, and as a result, they have to race somebody. So they invite the farmers out in Western Massachusetts at UMass, the University of Massachusetts, my alma mater for my PhD. They invite us farmers from Western Mass into Boston to race against Harvard. And guess what? The farmers win! It creates a meritocracy in college sports. Meritocracy meaning it's not an aristocracy. College sports becomes all about who is better on the river or the field or the ice, right? It's not about who has the most elite educational background or it comes from the most elite lineage, right? It's not an aristocracy. It doesn't matter who your heirs are. All that matters is what merit do you have in a particular sport, right? So even though Harvard was much more prestigious than UMass, UMass could come and play against Harvard on this field in this zero-sum competition. And that created our system of meritocracy in college sports, something that we very much enjoy in March Madness, right? That's a big staple of March Madness is, yes, you have the elite basketball programs, but you get the Cinderellas. That started all the way back in 1871, and it's a tradition that continues today and is not as common in other parts of the world in terms of their athletic competitions. I already said that. UMass Farmers beat Harvard's elite. Go UMass, the Minutemen. So why did this all happen in the U.S.? What are the origins of all of this? We just talked about intercollegiate athletics starting in Oxford and Cambridge. So why did it become such a spectator sport in the U.S. but not the rest of the world? Well, for one thing, we had many more universities than they did in Oxford. Than they did in England. Higher education was very much thought of, not just in England, but around the rest of the world, outside the U.S., as being something for aristocrats, being for the elite class. Our forefathers had a lot of vision and foresight in setting up many universities, public universities, to be not just for the elite people, but for the everyday working class residents of the state to help move the economy forward, our U.S. economy. As a result, our educational system became egalitarian. We had this belief in meritocracy. So egalitarian just means that everyone is equal and should have an equal chance at going and achieving higher education, right? Now, is it actually equal? Does everybody have an equal chance? Is it really egalitarian? No, we all know that it's not. However, it is more egalitarian in the U.S. higher education than it is in the rest of the world. Very much so. Although the rest of the world has come a long way since in the last 50 years in that regard. However, the government intervenes very early on to democratize higher education. All that means is that they make it available to the people, right? Democracy, meaning of the people. They do this by creating these land grant institutions. Here's a couple different acts. The Northwest Ordinance, which annexed a bunch of land and set up the conditions for a bunch of this land in what we now think of as the Midwest. Well, they thought of it as the Midwest then, which is why it's called the Midwest, but it's not really that west in our country nowadays. Anyway, the Northwest Ordinance comes along, sets up the conditions for these territories to become states, and part of that includes allocation of land for public institutions of higher education. Same thing happens in the Morrill Land Grant Act about a century later, or a little less than a century later. And because of these land grant institutions, we get colleges, very large colleges, that tend to be college towns. The town formulates around the college. The college was actually there before the town. Whereas in the rest of the world, most of their universities have developed more recently. I say most, right? Not all. Oxford and Cambridge predate Harvard and Yale. But they're institutions for everybody, for the working class, for the middle class. Those institutions tend to be in urban areas because they're more recent and the city already existed and the university is founded within the city. But that's not how it developed for us. And because of that, because you have these college towns, it influences the identity, right? The identity of the town takes on the identity of the university. And then as a resident, when you go to that university, you are immersed in that identity. Right? The whole town is all about that particular school, and it becomes part of your own identity, right? And we've learned throughout the semester, throughout the term, about the role that identity plays in sports and sports fandom. So if you're really attached to a university, you want to see that university maybe compete and exhibit some superiority over another university. Where does that happen? In a zero-sum competition on the sporting fields or courts or ice, pools, wherever. So it has, excuse me, a big influence on identity. And the institutions, because they're named by the states, or after the states, many of them, or some of them by the cities, or regions of the state, like us in Northern Kentucky, it becomes a foci of state pride, of local pride. And what ends up happening is you have residents of the state that didn't even attend the institution, but see the institution and the teams of the sports teams of the institution representing the entire state. And so residents that did not even go to not only that college, but maybe any college, they will still root on Big Blue Nation, right? They'll root on the Kentucky Wildcats because they feel like the Kentucky Wildcats are representing the entire state, and not just their institution. And the same thing happens in cities, right? In the city of Louisville, they see the University of Louisville basketball team is representing the city of Louisville. Also, because these institutions tend to be rather large compared to the private institutions, they produce lots of graduates. And just by sheer numbers, you produce lots of graduates over a long period of time, and some of those graduates are going to advance into high status positions, meaning in legislatures, where they're going to continue to get the benefits of state funding. That's one of our challenges, being a young institution at NKU, is that we do not have a long history of producing lots of graduates and haven't turned out huge numbers of people yet. So we don't have the numbers out there of alumni. We certainly have some influential alumni, but not in large numbers yet. So that's contrasted to private schools where, they're not thought of as being public or representing a city or representing a state necessarily, with a few exceptions. They're thought of as still being sort of more elite and not necessarily for the everyday person or resident of the middle class. So hopefully this lesson has taught you, ended up being a little bit of a history lesson, but hopefully you enjoyed it. And it's important to understand the history behind this, not only so that we can appreciate it and treat it well if we're working in that area of the industry, but also because of the identity implications and the understanding of what college sports can mean to people, not just at the institution, but within an entire state or within a region. It also helps us to understand how certain sports develop, and how certain economies develop around particular sports. So it's relevant in that regard as well.